Hi, first of all, good morning. I want to thank the team of Noah Techniques for giving me the pleasure to be here. And I would say that, first of all, I would say that whenever I'm in a philosophy conference, I'm having this sort of pharmacological experience in a way, because my studies were all made outside philosophy, never studied philosophy. So there's these moments in these conferences where I think that I'm negatively shut out, but at the same time, the fact that sometimes I'm shut out of it, it also provides me with insight from outside. So I'd like to, and you're going to see in a moment that this is not going to be, my presentation is not going to be strictly philosophical. So I want to stress this out. The second thing is I'd like to congratulate Bernard for the 20th anniversary of his first book, La Technique du Temps. Lastly, before I start reading, I would also like to say that at this moment I'm working in the crossing of the concept of pharmacon and cinema, but also to understand the nature of composition, how it changed, the nature of composition with images and sounds throughout the time, but especially to arrive at digital times. So in a way, what I'm going to read to you today is just a curiosity that emerged out of this. It's not exactly the center of it, but it emerged out of this. So I'll read that. I think it will take around 30 minutes. Let's see. I would like to start out my presentation by saying what it will not be about. Firstly, it will not be about the philosophical or scientifical nature of sleep, shadow, or light, and a consequent question of understanding the nature of Aufklärung since Kant. Secondly, my presentation will not go back so much as to point all the whole genealogy of light against darkness that could bring forward other dualities such as the Aristotelian dynamis versus energeia and even ile versus morphe. This said, I will tell you what my presentation is about. It is about the comparison and an intuition. The comparison is between metaphors of light and darkness. The intuition will aim to look at cinema as an operative model of knowing as relation that mimes the question of the connection between light and shadow in terms of symbolism, but also at a literal level. On the passage from one sphere to the other, I will be referring to Pasolini's vision of the lucciole, fireflies, in connection to the end of sleep in last year's book, 24/7, Late Capitalism and the Ends of Sleep by Jonathan Crary. In 1941, Pier Paolo Pasolini wrote a letter to his teenage years friend, Franco Farolfi, where he said, I quote, "Friendship is a very beautiful thing. On the night that I talk you about, we dined in Paderno, and afterwards we climbed until Pieve dei Pino in a darkness without moon, and we saw an enormous quantity of fireflies that formed little woods of fire, and we envied them because they loved each other, because they searched for each other and their lights while we were dry and we were only males in an artificial vagrancy." End of quotation. Although it is evident that these are a young man's writings, he was 19 at the time, and with it a certain romanticized vision of things, the fireflies are here connected with love. They have the ability to love one another. Another point that I would like to stress now and will refer later, this is a scene taking place, he writes, in a night without moon. If this is where the fireflies show up for the first time in Pasolini's work, it is not only until 34 years later, in 1975, and 9 months before his murder in Ostia, that they become a true symbol of something. He wrote in Corriere della Sera an article about the political situation in his country called Il vuoto del potere in Italia, the power void in Italy, that later reappeared in his Scritti Corsari, Corsair writings, under the famous title L'articolo del Lucciole, the article of the fireflies. He wrote, I quote again, "In the beginning of the 60s, due to air pollution and above all in the countryside due to water pollution, the fireflies began to disappear. It was a fulminant and lightning event. After some years, there were no more fireflies, and there were only a pungent remembrance of the past." End of quotation. This is today known as the disappearance of the fireflies, and it is a metaphor for what he thought as the irremediable decadence of culture, and with it, its symbols of innocence and resistance that were those glowing insects in the night. I will not go into detail with the context of this poetic ecological image, and will only say that this characterized for Pasolini a moment of cultural genocide brought by a second subterranean, invisible, and post-historic moment of fascism in Italy, much more effective than the one lived under Mussolini until 1945. For the first time, the power of the myth and the resistance engraved in the people's faces and actions, that was the power and ideological belief that motioned his creative drive, were then obnubilated by a televisual neo-fascism that G.P. Cournier, in an article of 2005 called La Disparition de Lucciole, characterized as being more profound because, and I quote, "it leaves nothing out of its despotic kingdom without reference and without control." End of quotation. In a way, Pasolini recognizes the installation of the Société du Spectacle and its blinding light. We could say that Pasolini is with Adorno recognizing that culture is not a protection against barbarism and should be saved from it, but it is now the place where the new forms of barbarism take place. But on the contrary to Adorno that believed in the forms of high culture, Pasolini worked from within an idea of mythicized primitivism of the poor classes and as a focus of resistance. However, this potential for resistance was over for Pasolini in 1975. And the Firefly articles leaves him with no hope at all. This is precisely what Georges Didier Berman, in a book he wrote in 2009 about this subject, with the title Survivance de Lucciole, criticizes. He aims at Pasolini's apocalyptical, defeated tone, and he writes, one thing is to designate the totalitarian machine, another completely different thing is to attribute to it a victory that is both definitive and without share. Was the world subjugated like it was dreamed, projected, programmed, and imposed by our treacherous counselors? To accept it is exactly to give credit to what their machine wants us to believe. It is solely to see the black night or the blinding light of the spotlights. It is to act like the defeated. It is to be convinced that the machine accomplishes its job without resistance. It is to see nothing more. It is not to be able to see the space, be it interstitial, intermittent, nomad, situated in the improbable, of the overtures, the possibles, the glimpses, the despites of. End of quotation. In a way, that reminds the critic that Bernard Stiegler establishes itself to the French theory in état de choc by not having thought correctly the shadow of the unconscious in between the duality lightness and darkness of Aufklärung. Later in the same chapter, Différence et répétition, Stiegler quotes Derrida. I quote, "L'avenir ne peut s'anticiper que dans la forme du danger absolu." End of quotation. This is just a fragment of what Stiegler, in my interpretation, wants to exemplify. Similarly to what Huberman reproaches Pasolini, the French philosopher is pointing out that certain post-structuralism could not handle positively the problem pointed out by critical theory. Instead, it is left with the recognition of the triumph of the bêtise and its subsequent disconstructive discouragement. What seems to separate both critics of this appearance of a techno-pessimism left in the void, of the incapacity of passer à l'acte, is the fact that they seem to differ on what is the most appropriate positive action. For Huberman, there is a positive aspect around the resistant act. This resistance is seen in an interpenetration of art and history, and here specifically, the resistance within what is named as la sopravvivenza, or Nachleben, as you all know, a concept worked from Aby Warburg. And this takes the form of multiple sparks and decentralized counterpowers that work in the dark and are still the image of those fireflies surviving, though fireflies Pasolini couldn't see anymore. These fireflies Pasolini could see anymore. On the contrary, for Stigler, a narrative of resistance doesn't help to hide a state of inachèvement of the French main thinkers between the 60s and the 2000s. For him, resistance must give place to invention as a pharmacological positive act by the interplay of a triple processes of individuation, psychic, collective, and technical. But let us not move from our first intention, the stressing of the question of light and darkness. For Didier Huberman, the fireflies are not gone, neither environmentally, neither politically. What changed was the capacity of the observer to see them. This observer, as Pasolini, has renounced to see them. They stayed in the same place, which is not the most appropriate to spot them anymore. And it is only in the strict sense that one can say that they disappeared. It looks like it is a matter of our eyes not being able to adjust to see forms in total darkness or in total light. The totality of it might send us to an exhaustion of the interplay of the dialectic vision of both extremities. In Dante's Divine Comedy, and more specifically in the Canto 26, there is a reference to the fireflies, lucciole, as opposed to the big lights of paradise, luce. The poet looks at a sort of political ditch, the eighth ditch of hell, where there are some notable men of Florence, This space is full of little flames that look like fireflies. Opposed to the big expanding light of paradise, the fireflies just fly intermittently in a shadowy hole, as if the flames were connected with the sins of the dishonest politicians. Similar relation between light and darkness can be sensed in the conceptualizing of enlightenment, with the lumière corresponding to the majority of reason, with the Platonic heritage of inside, outside, the cave, as spaces of illusion and knowledge. However, as Foucault stated while interpreting Kant's Was ist Aufklärung, the process itself of enlightenment indicates some ambition of self-reflection, of defining itself for the first time without recurring to the early modernity opposition that would maintain the duality between antiquity versus the modern. If one cannot but accept that rationality is on the side of light here, this idea of majority, commonly phrased as the common sense, in the common sense as of not depending upon others to make certain decisions, it seems to open the gate for a space of revolution, a moment, firstly, of inversion of polarities, and then rearticulation of elements in between light and darkness. The importance of the space in between, the shadow as a space of deprivation of light by an obstacle, belongs to this rearticulating accomplishment by the thinking for itself and, as Foucault wrote, of the new repartition and distribution between the gouvernement de soi et des autres. This is why it seems evident that Pasolini's metaphor and its expansion by Jonathan Crary, as we'll see in a moment, both echo the literality on human individuation. It is due to the inner light and darkness, and the light and darkness that shapes the form of collective individuation, that Bernard Stiegler can call the unconscious a space of shadow and write, and I quote again, État de choc, Le pharmacon, c'est-à-dire la répétition, c'est-à-dire aussi la technique en général, et en particulier les mnémotechniques, constituant les rétentions tertiaires, est la condition d'articulation des ombres et des lumières, de l'inconscient et de la conscience, de l'individuation psychique et de l'individuation collective. End of quotation. Now I remember, I saw that I left this quotation in French, sorry. I translated all the others. It was in the aftermath of the Second World War that Adorno and Horkheimer, by denouncing the instrumentality of reason and its necessity for self-preservation, showed that the brightness of the lights of paradise, salvation and knowledge were spotted as containing fragments of darkness. The lights were then not a precise historical moment, the 18th century Aufklärung, but a general movement of civilizational compression of myth in favor of reason. However, the values light-darkness began only to be reversed in the context of the first signs of exhaustion of a mechanical and electrical process of industrialization. Adorno's concept of cultural industries already takes place in its center, and I quote him, "Through their ubiquitous use under the pressure of the system, advertising techniques have invaded the idiom, the style of the culture industry. So complete is their triumph that in key positions it is no longer even explicit. The imposing buildings of the big companies, floodlit advertisements in stone, are free of advertising, merely displaying the illuminated company initials on their pinnacles, with no further need of self-congratulation. By contrast, the buildings surviving from the 19th century, the architecture of which still shamefully reveals their utility as consumer goods, their functions as accommodation are covered from basement to above roof level with hoardings and banners." End of quotation. We could see clearly that light here, as in Pasolini, as in Didier Huberman, as in A Sign of the Cultural Industries, are a sort of anti-Aufklärung. As the Italian filmmaker wrote in 1941, he saw fireflies in a darkness without moon, and I referred back to the expression in the beginning. I might add, he could only see them in this condition. He could only produce something with this perception, a shadowy third term in between the contrasts of small glimpses of light and a moonless night. Didier Huberman confirms this Adornian state of things. "It was not in the night that the fireflies were gone. They disappeared," and I quote him again, "in the blinding light of the fierce projectors, the voyeuristic projectors, the political shows, the football stadiums, and the TV stages." End of quotation. It seems now clear, to introduce Crery's last book, that the end of sleep as a state of terminal capitalism is the next act of this sleepless sleep, as above mentioned, or sleeping with one's eyes open, as it is commonly phrased. And I quote him, "To wake is to recover authenticity as opposed to the numbed vacancy of sleep. But this whole category of figures and metaphors is now incongruous in the face of a global system that never sleeps, as if to ensure that no potentially disturbing awakening is ever necessary or relevant." And end of quotation. Between literality and metaphor, two or three different things will relate to my purpose here today. The first is indeed very in your face and immediate. The end of sleep is seen as an horizon that aims at eliminating the, and I quote, "the divergence between a human world and the operation of global systems with the capacity to occupy every waking hours of one's life." End of quotation. The elimination of difference in the endless, homogeneous assembly line, a continuity's life's editing mise en scène of technical repetitions. The man that never sleeps is tempted to simulate the non-human properties and temporalities of the digital zones one is already inhabiting for much of each day, and lives in the fantasy of a loner, the last self-made man, that will or could survive despite the destruction of civil society and the elimination of institutions that retain any resemblance of social protection or mutual support, whether public education, social services, or healthcare for those most in need. End of quotation. Secondly, at the end of the book, Crery makes it clear that he intends makes it clear that what he intends by no sleep is the end of sociability, or transindividuation in Stigler's terms. Light and darkness, being awake and being asleep, are signs of a model of action and pause, of taking turns, that is incompatible with the endless algorithmic efficiency of 24/7 capitalism, with the elimination moments of reflection, of prendre soin, and the interplay of idealism and form upon which logos and techne interact. Thirdly, and with this I will be quickly entering the consideration of cinema, I would like to focus for a bit in Creary's reference to Stigler's vision in the book. In chapter 2, the author writes that for him, the problem of temporal objects and their capture of attentiveness or mass reception, which he phrases as Stigler's main concern, is secondary to the larger systemic colonization of the individual experience and the remaking of attention into repetitive operations and responses that always overlap with acts of looking and listening. So this is for him the main concern. The remaking of attention into repetitive operations and responses that always overlap with acts of looking and listening. Oh, sorry. For one, what seems circumstantial remark seems not to have into account Stigler's distinction between tertiary retention and a temporal object. Also, Creary himself centers the problem a few pages early of the 24/7 period of perpetual illumination and the extinguishing of darkness and obscurity into a problem, and I quote him, of incapacitation of visual experience, of, and I quote again, disintegration of human abilities to see, and not so much of changes in new machine forms of visualization, he says. This approach seems to forget that the post-media condition we live in and what can make us think, paradoxically or not, of the mediation itself as a technical object, as Anaïs Noni talked this year at Pharmacon's Académie d'été, is the overcoming of a thinking that treats media as mere instruments of action. Media is none other than the sums of new machines' forms of visualization and other kinds of machines, of course, not only visualization. But I was saying that media is none other than the sums of new forms of visualization and cultural practices engaged in a technological dynamic that extends both man and their ability to see and media itself. The homogeneity of edgeless lightness that causes blindness cannot be thought without taking these heterogeneous and materialist elements that created it or are creating it. It is now a commonplace to point out that the crisis of image is going back to back with the decadence of culture, of going further with the general disindividuation. Creary quotes Godard in Éloge d'amour. He quotes, quand est-ce que le regard a basculé? And immediately answers that for him and Godard, it is clear that the crisis of the observer and the image is a cumulative one with overlapping historical roots unrelated to any specific technologies. I will not play the same key with what seems his disregard of a transformative power of concrete technologies, but I will just utilize his words to help me sketch the strategic place of cinema within this articulation of light and shadow. It would be almost pointless to exhaust here the examples that can point us the absolute ontological importance of light and darkness in an invention attributed to a pair of brothers called Lumière. If the crisis of the observer and the image go together, it is because cinema plays, as Bernard Stiegler proved in 2001 in Le temps du cinéma et la question du mal-être, a vital point both in the mal and in the être. This was a concrete application to our exhausted hyper-industrial times of a correct placing of techniques within the dynamics of the human he started to develop in the book we are here celebrating today, the 20th anniversary. If photography was soon on the side of the death of moment, the freezing and immobility of time with cinema things, if photography was soon as on the side of the death of moment, the freezing and immobility of time, with cinema things were different. Its apparatus offered a new type of composition between frames of immobility that could simulate movement and, due to this, could be placed together with the human on the side of kinesis and what is in the process of being individuated, life. By proving that perception was a process of real-time editing, by selection and projection of primary, secondary, and tertiary retentions, Stigler was putting cinema at the heart of humans' inner projection booth. Today, it is easy to see in the voyeuristic impulse of Facebook, for example, a more accomplished and efficient version of the exploration of that impulse by what cinema could manage, the taming of temporal repetition in a dark envelope called movie theater. The reach for the small screens through Fordian clicks made the participant active in his own passiveness. In a way, cinema, as a continuation of accelerated shocks of modernist urban cities, posed the question of the desynchronization between different solicitations and time for thinking. In an almost caricatural way, the French writer Georges Duhamel wrote in the 1930s, referring to cinema, and I quote him, "The images in motion occupied the place of my thoughts, and therefore he could no longer think what he wanted." This double capture of time's cinematic flux by human conscious was explained by Stigler in 2001, and of course is one of the main elements when considering cinema's manipulative power. Assembly lines, editing timelines were always produced over repetition, and today, in a process similar to when Foucault remembered that the panoptical could spare the presence of the watcher, this is interiorized by the participation of the user in that capture, making it more effective. None of this is really new for sure. Now, even the fact that in 24/7, no lights of flight or hypotheses of deterioration on site is just a giant mise-en-scène of our lives as if in a classical Hollywood film, not even one element of directing and its invisible style of editing out of place. And here, just as it happened with the decrease of importance of the luminescence horror of cinematic medium, the issue of darkness plays an important role. Cinema became popular with imprisoned forms of light and darkness. Its signification model is literally the composition of shadowy forms from the interplay of these two specters. Cinema became popular with imprisoned forms of light and darkness in a screen frame surrounded by this other frame of blackness that was the architecture of the movie theater. This one helped to focus our attention by telling us where to look at, and more importantly, that made the separation with the light of reality outside. The waning of traditional cinema with its escape from movie theaters, as with the question of deprivation of sleep, the decadence of attention, or the abrasive luminescent light that blinds our eyes to the fireflies, whatever they may stand for, are still the same question of eradication of these blacknesses. In 1994, Jean-Claude Carrière, the famous screenwriter of the later phases of Louis Buñuel career, wrote in a book called The Secret Language of Film that soon cinema imposed on itself the goal to show everything. This ideal or myth of Bazanian total cinema created a natural technical limitation in cinema, but also in its processes of signification, in extremis, to show everything. To expose all images is the equivalent of having cinema at its utmost velocity. The sum of all lightnesses, of all images, the potentiality of the movement at its limit would produce the black. More than explaining that cinema faded away because its moving image is today too slow, too rigid of interaction, and short of giving us the world, this idea is a good metaphor for digital architecture and the culture of open access, with no idea yet of an individuating interplay between light and darkness. Excessive light with no hermeneutic darkness produces pitch black, and the inverse is also true. However, We can only signify in or through shadow, that is, the interplay, or both. The more recent debates about the specificity of the medium of cinema in the context of the fusing of its impure nature with other arts, installation, video art, etc., slowly went into the representation of the question of immateriality. André Parente, a Brazilian film theoretician, in his essay Cinema in Transit, From the Dispositive of Cinema to the Cinema of the Dispositif, from 2007, writes about this term he coined cinema form. This designates traditional cinema around its three material elements: the architecture of the movie theater, the technology of capturing projection, and the narrative form. And he calls attention to the fact that it is only, of course, a particular form of cinema that became historical, economical, and social hegemonic around a narrative industrial representative model based on an aesthetics of transparency. What Parente is aiming at is to demonstrate that the concept of dispositif, which was created in the 70s with the works of Baudry, Christian Metz, Thierry Kuntzel, to denounce the non-indifferent nature of the presentation of the ideological machine of Hollywood that kept us trapped in Plato's cinematic cave, despite being caught in some sort of idealism that doesn't take into account the heterogeneity of the structure of cinematic discourses, is already opened and relational to different aspects. The production of the cinema effect over the spectator is the result of material, psychological, and ideological aspects of the cinematic dispositif. This openness, this heterogeneity of elements, also present in Foucault's, Deleuze's, and Lyotard's approach to the question of the dispositif, is since the beginning a reality in cinema. The first experimentations pre-Lumière, the experimental cinema, the expanded cinema, Raymond Bellour, Entre Images, to explore the coming of video, the interactive digital cinema, all have in common to show cinema outside this cinema form as a closed vision of industrial cinema dispositif and point out each crystallization under a different formation or episteme. On my part, I decided to take precisely this term cinema form to designate something else. Despite this being a work in process, if I had to define, I would say that cinema form is an operative model, a transitive operation of manipulation and creation of meanings from the iterative and progressive juxtaposition of moving images in a continuous flux. Last year at Épinay, I tried to explain in Simondon's terms how it is possible that the technical concretization of what we term by cinema could lead us together the interior and immaterial dimension of spiritual inner cinema and this material historical form that has few more than 100 years ago. And consider cinema form as a sort of pragmatic operation, a new stage of metastability that gathers all real. In this whole, the process of selection as montage sisyphically sees us going out of the cave of darkness, abolishing the difference between nature and interface, having images and sounds as rival objects of existence that impel us to re-edit the regimes of materiality in the network. If we cannot control cinema anymore, and we know that to close it ideological in films, in Histoire du cinéma, in Ends of cinema, permits us to better comprehend and master this transductive operation of transference of forms between materials, of temporary close of the flux, so as to cognitively and emotionally map possibilities. And I quote here Stephen Shavir in his last book, not exactly last, before this one, Post-Cinematic Effect, where he sees that this is the possibility to see the contours of the wall of prison in which we are in. It is not short of irony as well that Godard's Histoire of Cinema started writing the future of it the moment he proposed to elaborate on his past history. To conclude, cinema form is the operative process of signification within a plastic fabric that supports and aggregates all in a dynamism produced by circulation. In a moment that we canalize our energy towards the light, the spectacle, that we manipulate in an infinitive network, history and archival elements instead of nature ones, cinema form works as a kind of materialization of this transductive form, which helps to deal with this moment of hyper-individuation on the culture of images. It is in this operation of reunion of iterative meanings that cinema, or its form, in the sense that the form is also a temporary stop, still survives. In a way, we can say that the open and transductive form of cinema, since the beginning, searched for this new matter for which to make a body with. In other words, the accomplishment of cinematic movement claimed the corporeal death of its traditional medium already. To conclude, this is the final. So this is the conclusion before conclusion. To conclude, the reason why I chose to mediate Pasolini and Crary metaphors with cinema form is the second part of my presentation, is because it is on cinema form is on this axial point, I think, that it organizes transitively these two dimensions at the same time. On the one side, the relationship between images as continuity and stop in the editing process in a dynamic produced from the interplay of its synthetic and analytic elements. On the other side, that dynamic is at the same time a transductive process creating meaning out of the interplay between light and darkness. This meaning, these animated shadows, are none other than temporary and possible materialization of dreams that become real, with the condition that they are not totally light, the pure possibility, neither totally darkness, the pure constraint. Thank you.